More than 80 years ago, the Empire of Japan attacked the main U.S. Pacific Fleet base at Pearl Harbor on the island of Oahu. In 1941 for the United States as well as the USSR, this incident was the unexpected beginning of the war, causing great loss of life and moral shock, although the Japanese success was not as devastating as initially thought. But how Japan, despite the superiority of the United States in all respects, decided to attack, you will know in this clip. Since the beginning of 1937 the Japanese occupied Manchuria and created a puppet state there. In July 1937 they began active hostilities against China, capturing Beijing, Shanghai, Tianjin, Nanjing, and other key cities. At the beginning of the 20th century, the United States insisted on the open-door principle with respect to China and expressed its categorical opposition to any attempt by other countries to establish their influence there, let alone attempts to establish complete control there. On September 1941 the United States imposed an embargo on iron and scrap metal shipments to Japan, and on July 26th on petroleum and petroleum products. Considering that only the minimum daily consumption of Japan was about 28,000 tons of oil, and when the fleet was at sea, the fuel consumption was 400 tons per hour, it is clear that the sanctions led Japan to a choice: to change its policy or to try to seize territories with oil reserves, starting with Indonesia. A preliminary step in this plan was the neutralization of the American fleet. As American historian David Rohl notes, the main motive that precipitated the attack on Pearl Harbor was the issue of oil, or more precisely, its scarcity in the Japanese. In December of 1941 the Japanese government considered the war with China almost won. Internally, there was a dispute between the northern and southern parties over the direction of further expansion, to the Soviet Far East or to the Pacific Basin. Unlike the Germans, the Japanese did not consider Russia a weak opponent, and even if they were successful in capturing the sparsely populated and cold territories where no oil was produced, they saw little benefit and no solution to the oil problem. The final decision was made at a meeting of the emperors on July 2, 1941, where it was decided to prepare for a strike in the south. Earlier, on April 10, 1941 on the basis of the first air fleet in the Japanese Navy formed a mobile force under the command of Vice Admiral Nagumo Chuichi, which was called Kido Butai. Initially, they consisted of 5 aircraft carriers, but by the winter of 1941-42 they were added 1 more aircraft carrier, and as a result, they consisted of 6 aircraft carriers: Akagi, Kaga, Hiryu, Soryu, Shokaku, and Zuikaku, whose flagship was Akagi, capable of carrying 63 aircraft. The most modern ships in the lineup were Shokaku and Zuikaku, capable of carrying up to 84 airplanes built in August and September of 1941. In all, the squadron consisted of over 389 aircraft, of which 350 were intended to strike Pearl Harbor and 39 to protect the squadron from American counterattacks. The squadron also included 2 battleships, 2 heavy and 1 light cruiser, 9 destroyers, and 5 submarines. The creation of such a force, capable of carrying out the operation in Hawaii, was aimed at neutralizing the U.S. Pacific Fleet, which would allow the Japanese Army to carry out the occupation of territories in Southeast Asia and a number of islands in the Pacific Ocean. At dawn, about 5:30 on the morning of December 7, 1941 Japanese heavy cruisers sent 2 reconnaissance planes to Hawaii. The reconnaissance pilots realized that American forces might spot them, so the time between reconnaissance and strike was reduced to the minimum of 30 minutes needed to relay information. Japanese commanders needed detailed information on the location of the American fleet, the condition of defenses, and weather conditions. From 6 aircraft carriers took off 183 planes of the first wave. At 6:37, they began their flight toward Hawaii. Halfway to Pearl Harbor, one of the U.S. radar stations detected the air group. The operators of the station reported it to headquarters, but the headquarters brass was at breakfast, so only Lutty Kermit Tyler was at the radar control post. He interpreted the report of a large group of planes as a bomber squadron approaching from the U.S. mainland. At 7:35, a scout from the cruiser Tikuma broke the radio silence and reported that 9 battleships, 1 heavy, and 6 light cruisers were at Pearl Harbor. 3 minutes later, he added that the weather and visibility were normal. Then a second scout reported that there were no enemy ships in Lahaina. Based on this data, Kido Butai's command decided to concentrate on striking the shallow harbor at Pearl Harbor rather than the deep water anchorage at Lahaina. At 7:49, a signal was broadcast over the radio that signaled the beginning of the attack. Torpedo carriers attacked battleship Oklahoma and then West Virginia. Battleships Arizona, Tennessee, California, and Nevada were the next targets. The 54 Nakajima bombers of the second wave attacked coastal airfields. The attack lasted 90 minutes, after which the Japanese carriers took on the planes and withdrew. A total of 353 planes, including escort fighters, participated in the attack. The Japanese sank 4 American battleships, 2 destroyers, and 1 destroyer. 4 more battleships, 3 cruisers, and 1 destroyer were damaged. On the ground, 188 airplanes were destroyed, and 159 were damaged. There were 2,403 American servicemen killed and 1,178 wounded. Japanese losses totaled 64 men and 29 planes, 15 bombers, 5 torpedo bombers, and 9 fighters, and 5 ultra-small submarines. The next day after the attack, U.S. President Franklin Roosevelt delivered a war message to the nation in Congress. War was declared on Japan. In terms of immediate effect, the success of the operation exceeded all expectations. The U.S. Navy recovered from losses for 6 months, during which time Japan easily captured a number of territories: Indonesia, Hong Kong, the Philippines, Singapore, Burma, and Malaya. However, U.S. losses were not critical, and the base at Pearl Harbor kept its fuel storage, piers, shipyard, power plant, and headquarters buildings intact. America's newest and most powerful battleships, North Carolina and Washington, were not damaged because they were elsewhere at the time of the attack, and 8 other similar ships were under construction at the same time. In response to the attack on April 18, 1942, bombers from the aircraft carrier Hornet struck Tokyo, Nagoya, and Yokosuka, later called the Doolittle Raid, the first time bombs fell on the capital of the Empire of Japan, previously considered out of reach of enemy aircraft. American naval intelligence in early '43 carried out an operation code-named Vengeance to eliminate the commander-in-chief of the Japanese Navy, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, who carried out the attack on Pearl Harbor. After that, the hunt for the admiral began. They tried to follow him, tried to intercept his conversations on the radio. In the end, the Americans got the admiral's flight schedule, and as a result of an air battle, a U.S. Air Force pilot, Letter Rex Barber, shot down Admiral Yamamoto's plane. The phrase Pearl Harbor came to symbolize to the Americans an unexpected and heavy defeat, followed by a sense of confusion and helplessness. After the attack on Hawaii, the American authorities took harsh measures, especially at home. Between 1941 and 1942, more than 120,000 Japanese Americans living on the West Coast were sent to special camps because of doubts about their loyalty. The camps were officially called relocation centers, but were often referred to as concentration camps as well. General John Lesesne Dewitt, in charge of the evacuation, expressed his judgment frankly, stating that a Jap is always a Jap, and that American citizenship did not guarantee loyalty. Today, December 7th, is no longer just a day of infamy, as Roosevelt said, but a national day of remembrance. This day was celebrated before, but the status of a national holiday was secured by an executive order of President Barack Obama. The former military base has been turned into a memorial where veterans, active military, and tourists from Japan visit every year. The battleship Arizona, sunk during the 1941 attack, remained in place without being raised. A concrete memorial has been erected over its hull, and the deck is visible underwater. Oil continues to leak out of the engine room as tears for the fallen crew. By tradition, every U.S. president is expected to honor fallen sailors at the site of the Arizona tragedy. Nearby stands the battleship Missouri, on which the surrender of Japan was signed on September 2, 1945, thus turning defeat into victory.